Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the Dela Cruz collection. My name is Yvette Yanez. I'm the director. Carlos and Rosa de la Cruz and all of us here are pleased to welcome back to Miami Dr. Robert Hobbs. Recognized as a scholar, teacher, and curator, Dr. Hobbs specializes in both late modern and postmodern art. Please join me in welcoming Robert Hobbs.
I don't think I've ever had such a warm welcome in my life. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And there's several things that I would like to do tonight to accomplish. So I want to consider part of this almost like a class. Last semester, I taught a class on the Sublime. And I thought I knew can everyone hear me? And I thought I knew a great deal about the Sublime, and then I realized that I didn't. And I didn't realize that the Sublime has become so very important in the last 50 years. So what I would like to do tonight is I would like to give you a little bit of background on some of the major philosophers, theorists, thinkers on the Sublime, and then to show how it has been applied to by various artists. So if you'll bear with me, and there'll be hopefully time for questions and answers, and I may take a little longer than the usual 45 or 50 minutes, but I promise not to take too long. I would like to start off by saying, can you hear okay? Okay, is this better? Oh. It's kind of nice if one can do, is that okay? It's a great deal of power in this. If I can do an authoritative whisper, then it's kind of great. Anyway, when I started teaching in 1975, my first job was at Yale University. And the head of the department presented me with a copy of the book you see here by Robert Rosenblum. And the title of it was The Northern Romantic Tradition. And she said, you have to read this in order to teach your class. And I was teaching a class on abstract expressionism, and I did read the book, and I realized that what Robert Rosenblum was doing was updating an essay he had written in 1961 called The Abstract Sublime. And one of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to show how there was a connection between all these German artists of the late 18th and early 19th century and people like Rothko and Barnett Newman. And he basically said if things look similar, then there's a similarity of thought. There's a nice term for this, which is called the morphological fallacy, which you don't need to know. But anyway, it's the idea of morphology, of form, being similar. And the interesting thing about the book is that the cover, they made it look more like a Rothko than actually like a Caspar David Friedrich, so one would get the point. And so I started with that, and then I realized, no, there is much more that needs to be done, that yes, some abstract expressionists were concerned with the sublime, but others indeed weren't. And there were many different types of sublime that interested them. Just to give you an idea of some of the books that have been published in the last 20 years on the sublime, I copied some of the major ones that seemed important to me when I was teaching this class, so you can know that it indeed is a subject that is incredibly topical at this point. Let me start off with Longinus, and I'll talk only a few minutes about Longinus. We don't really know who Longinus was. People thought they knew that he was Cassius Longinus from the 3rd century BC. He was a Greek. And then they said, well, maybe he isn't this same person, that maybe it was just a book on rhetoric, on speaking. But it is the first ideas we have, and it codifies a whole Greek tradition on the sublime. And what they were doing is they were looking at the sophists, and the sophists were a group of philosophers who've gotten incredibly bad rap because basically they were people who went around and they gave talks like me. And you could say to a sophist, we'll give a talk on X, and they would do that. And then maybe you'd say, we'll give a talk on Y, and Y is the very opposite of X. And they would do that also. So they were considered pretty facile, actually. But the idea of the sublime for them had to do with public speaking. And it was a mixture of art and nature. And it was the idea that art was to be so realistic, and the speaker was to move people in such profound and meaningful ways that they would say, well, it's like a natural occurrence. It's like an event taking place. It's really very important in that respect. And it was supposed to be spoken with nobility, with sincerity, with great conviction, with tremendous force. And this long treatise, which has been translated, has many citations, and so I thought I would give you a couple of citations to give you this idea of how the speaker could merge with the message, how something very artificial could seem natural. And so the first is a poem by Sappho, and I've shortened it somewhat. But Sappho is basically looking at death and comparing death to an overpowering lover. And the interesting thing is the Sublime didn't start off as visual. It started off as something dealing with speech, with language, with rhetoric. So let me read this. Peer of gods, he seemed to me the blissful man who sits and gazes at thee before him. Close beside thee sits and in silence hears thee silvery speaking. Laughing loves low laughter. Oh, this only stirs the troubled heart of my breast to tremble. Sweat runs down in rivers, a tremor seizes all my limbs, and paler than grass in autumn, caught by pains and menacing death. I falter, lost in the love trance. And so this is given as one example of the Sublime, which is looking at death as one's lover coming forth. The second is from Homer's Iliad, and it's a characterization of the king of Troy's son, Hector, who is acknowledged as going to die. And yet this is one of his last battles, and it's quite a furious battle. And so in this treatise, Longinus says, this is a great example. So I'd like to for you to hear the language in your head. And he burst on them like a wave, swift rushing beneath black clouds, heaved huge by the winds, burst down on a ship in the wild foam shrouds. From the stem to the stern, her hull, and the storm blast's terrible breath roars in the sail. Another example of the Sublime, kind of idea of force, incredible force. Now, the Sublime was picked up again in the 17th and 18th century, and probably the next most important idea was presented by Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke later became very important as a politician. He wrote this in 1757, and it's called An Essay on the Sublime and the Beautiful. And he wanted to, it's a first systematic look at the sublime and its difference from the beautiful. And he picked up the idea of John Locke. He was who looked at the mind as like a blank theater screen, and only sensory impressions are formed on it. And so he was looking at the sublime primarily as psychological. And he was looking at it in terms of nature. And one of the famous terms is danger at a distance. And there was a feeling of delight, he said, with pain. He said beauty is smooth, it's pretty, it becomes pretty insipid, actually, when you read the treatise or the essay on the sublime and the beautiful. But the sublime is incredibly powerful. But he mentions this term of delight, and he said pain, deprivation, obscurity, darkness, fuscous colors, which are sort of dark, murky colors. All of these things would be one incredibly uncomfortable, and that the pain would be intolerable unless it's at a certain distance. And then he said, you get it at a distance, and it actually happens to be quite delightful. And so what he wanted to do was to put an aesthetic stamp on this idea of the sublime, and he did in this book. He talked about privations, and he also presented the sublime, giving you another. He said the sublime, he said beauty could be presented in terms of pictures, but he said the sublime, again going back to Longinus, fits in with language. And here's one of his best examples, which is looking at the son of Satan, who is death. So it's another look at death. We're obviously dealing with heavy-duty topics. And this is a very famous description. The other shape, if shape it might be called, that shape had none, distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance might be called that shadow seemed, for each seemed either. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart what seemed his head, the likeness of a kingly had on. And so this is what he presents with judicious obscurity as one of his terms. So the Burkean sublime he sees as death, but it's frequently seen in relationship to nature. He goes back and cites the 17th century painter Salvador Rosa, you see on the top, and he was certainly picked up by painters like Turner that you see on the bottom. Now, the Burkean sublime has continued into the 20th century, and probably one of the best examples is this amazing work by Julien Laverdiere and Paul Miotta of the Tribute in Light to the World Trade Center. And some people have said the terrace sublime comes out of the Burkean sublime, and its danger at less of a distance. The delight gets pushed off the table, but it does continue this idea into the 20th century. Not so sure about that. The technological sublime comes out of Burke also, and there have been a number of thinkers who've said, well, you know, the idea of the sublime changes over time. So what was considered sublime in the 19th century would not be sublime today. So you look at something like the Lackawanna Railway, with this figure seated here in the upper left, the figure with a red vest on, and he's looking at the Lackawanna Railroad. I think very few people would see this as sublime, or the tremendous number of stumps that have been cut down for trees that have been cut down. But a number of people do look at things like the NASA takeoff still as sublime, and they come for themselves to see it and are miles away from it. And so the technological sublime can be, yes, danger, force, at a kind of distance that is a Burkean type of sublime. The atomic sublime is an updating of this, and it's really quite interesting. When I was looking for images on the atomic sublime, I thought, well, if I show an atomic blast, and then I was looking for images to find of people who were seated, you know, the famous images of people with sunglasses who were seated back, who were invited, you know, even President Truman came and various dignitaries. I think every member of Congress saw one atomic blast or another at Los Alamos or nearby. So it was considered danger at a distance. It was very much a type of Burkean sublime. And that sense of thrill and delight at human power of look what we can do. And it was interesting when I was looking at the slides and the images that to me the image that is the most powerful is a 10.5-inch drawing by Robert Longo in the upper left, which really shows this kind of unbelievable power and force. And then I included the little postcard to see how it could be trivialized in terms of, you know, a tourist event. Now, I presented the Longinus or Longinian sublime, the Burkean sublime, and then the Kantian sublime is much more difficult to understand, but I think it is tremendously important. Kant was writing this in 1790 in his Critique of Judgment. And basically what he was trying to do in the Critique of Judgment, it was his third critique, and what you need to know is that aesthetics wasn't split off as a special area of philosophy until 1750. It was always subsumed under general philosophy. And what happened is that Kant said, well, I've done the critique of reason, the critique of practical judgment, but I really want to understand what is the criterion for making decisions, for making judgments. And he said, you know, there are two types of judgments. One is determinative judgment. That means you've got a set of coordinates, you've got a hypothesis, you've got a scientific law, and then you sort of say, well, does it fit in with this law? It's determined by a concept. The other that is much more important for Kant is reflective judgment. And he said, this is where the aesthetic comes in. And he basically suggested that if he got it right, he could revolutionize all of human thought and certainly all of philosophy. Tall order for the aesthetic. And he took up beauty and the sublime in the third judgment. And a reflective judgment has to be where you're not given any criterion on why you should make a choice of whether one work of art is good or not, or whether something is sublime or not. And he basically said with the sublime, and I'll mention this and then read these sections, is he said that the sublime is something where the imagination absolutely shuts off. Something is too big, like the idea of infinity. Something is too mighty and forceful, like a force of nature or a storm. And so basically what happens is the imagination shuts off. For me, if I think of the Big Bang Theory and I think of the order of the universe or the expanding universe or the end of the universe or infinity, something just shuts off. It's like a battery goes out and I just, can't think much more. That's when the imagination shuts off. And then Kant, being the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher, German idealist, took a step back and he empowered human beings. And he said, you know what's so great about the sublime? It's not that which makes the imagination shut off. It's not that fact of nature. What is sublime is human reason. And he said, that is a reflective judgment which ennobles all of human beings. It puts us in an ethical, moral order because we are making certain judgments about the fact that the imagination is shut off, but reason is able to wrap its head around the fact that the imagination doesn't work. Reason is bigger and more important than nature. I'm not sure people would buy into that now, but that was certainly Kant's idea. So let me read this very quickly on the mathematical sublime. Nothing that can be an object of the senses is to be called sublime. What happens is our imagination strives to progress toward infinity, while our reason demands absolute totality as a real idea. And so the imagination, our power of estimating the magnitude of things, in the world of sense is inadequate, so the inadequacy of the imagination. Yet this inadequacy itself is the arousal in us of the feeling that we have within us a supersensible power. And what is abundantly large is not an object of sense, not something that is out there, but is the use that judgment makes naturally of certain objects in the world, so as to arouse this feeling, and in contrast with that, use any other use. Any other use is small. Hence, what is to be called sublime is not the object, but the attunement that the intellect gets through a certain presentation that occupies reflective judgment. So what is sublime is us, not what has caused the imagination to shut down. And then let me continue. Hence, the feeling of the sublime in nature is respect for our own vocation, for us, for our own sense of reason, but by a certain subreption, and this is a word that people often stumble over, by a calculated misrepresentation in which the object, that is the object in nature, the infinity, is substituted for respect for the idea of humanity, our reason within ourselves. This respect is accorded an object of nature that, as it were, makes intuitable for us the superiority of the rational vocation of our cognitive powers, of our reason. And then I'm just showing you a diagram here of what happens in the first moment or the first stage. Imagination shuts off. What happens in the second stage? We become empowered by our sense of reason. And this Kantian sublime becomes supremely important in the last 40 or 50 years. These are three works by Friedrich that pick up on the Kantian sublime, the idea of being almost overpowered by the beauty, the force of nature, and yet pulling back from us and giving a certain strength, measure, proportion, bearing to the individuals who are looking at this sunrise or sunset or this sea of clouds, as you see here. What's interesting with the woman before the rising or setting sun, we don't know quite which it is that there's been a great deal of interest by feminists in the last few years in the Kantian Sublime. And I think they really haven't gone far enough, because some of them equate feminism with what Kant refers to nature as female, and he refers to reason as male. And they say the female is the other, and we have to deal with this. And I think that that doesn't quite give an adequate play to the Sublime, nor to a feminist rereading of it. I think the feminist rereading that is smartest, and I'll mention it in a minute, is the sort of going with the ecological Sublime and saying that reason isn't all in us. Reason is out there in nature, and if we understood enough the inner workings of nature, as with ecology, and how one thing impacts on another, then we get to another Sublime where nature itself has its own sense of reason. Of course, one of the great examples of an artist being interested in the Sublime is Barnett Newman, the mid-20th century abstract expressionist artist who painted this picture that I'm sure many of you have seen in the Museum of Modern Art. It is called Vir Heroicus Sublimus, man sublime and heroic. And it's about 6 feet tall, the painting, and I put in the little photograph at the bottom just to suggest that what Newman was looking for was he was looking some sort of affective sensory way of suggesting the kind of overpowering force of the sublime. And that idea of the sublime can certainly be seen in terms of the Burkean sublime, a kind of overpowering, but it can also be seen in terms of the Kantian sublime also. The Kantian sublime in the sense that when you see this, the red is so intense that you walk away from it and you just can only see red afterwards. It's really very powerful. And I just wanted to show an example of what might fit in with the mathematical sublime and Alan McCollum. He's done several of these. This is 10,000. You say, well, how can that be mathematical sublime? Because when you look at these, they're all very different, these little pieces that he's made, and it just boggles the mind. And that's when the imagination starts shutting off. And then when you start reasoning and thinking about, well, what is he doing here? One gets closer, one becomes closer to the Kantian sublime. And this is an example by an artist that I'm very fond of, a young artist who just had a show at MIT, Tavares Strachan. And he's from the Bahamas, and he's a Yale graduate, and he's really very smart, and because he's from the Bahamas and has moved to the US, he's really fascinated with the idea of what is happening there and what's happening here. And he found a beer bottle for this piece that is a Budweiser beer bottle that was broken, collected all of the small particles, and because he had studied at RISD with the glass program, he copied each individual sherd, so there are literally hundreds of them. And then like Noah's Ark, they're sort of lined up 2 by 2 all around. And you look at this and you say, oh my God, this is unbelievable, you know. And he doesn't want you to really figure out which is a copy of the other. And there's some people who say they can figure it out. My wife says, I can figure it out, I know. I don't really want to know because it's kind of fascinating here. It gets involved again with a catalyst for the Kantian sublime. The traumatic sublime is very powerful, and I think Joseph Beuys is one of the best examples of this. Traumatic sublime can be seen in relationship, certainly with the Burkean sublime, but it's less about delight. So I would almost put it in the category of the imagination shutting off. There's been a great deal of interest in trauma theory, and a number of artists have worked with trauma, and some people say, well, all art comes out of some sort of traumatic event. Trauma is, as the psychologist Carl Jung said, it's an invitation with the real. And the real for him is something that cannot be symbolized, something that's outside our symbolic order. And the traumatic sublime has to do, frequently it happens with, an incestuous event with a child, but something that is traumatic for me may not be traumatic for any one of you. What happens with the trauma is it is something that is so jarring to the senses and to the psychology of the individual that there is a lack of affect. One doesn't know how to respond to it emotionally. And because of that lack of affect, it's very much like the Kantian sublime of the imagination shutting off. And certainly an interesting example for this is the artist Joseph Beuys. And Joseph Beuys has talked about Auschwitz, which he said it cannot be represented as an image. He says he wants to allude to certain things. There was a very important interview in Penthouse magazine in 1980 that is cited a great deal with Beuys, and he talks about homeopathy and sort of like heals like. And if you know about homeopathic medicines or something, you take a little bit of that poison, you re-inject it back into the body, and that poison, which could kill you or make you sick, also can create a situation for antibodies and other things, and it can make you actually well. And it's an idea that comes out of the 18th and 19th century, this idea of homeopathy. And Beuys said that the whole experience of Auschwitz was a primary experience. I'll read this. That shock is my primary experience, my fundamental experience, which led me to really begin to make art. And people have said, well, if you're doing this, and I'm showing you an object that is in the Tate Gallery as it was on the left when it was acquired and is now. It's an object which is actually aged. And we tend to think of works of art as being timeless, immortal. They last. We may not last, but they certainly do. And there are a number of artists who are interested in the whole effect of time. Certainly someone like Jim Hodges, who's amply showed upstairs, is very interested in time and how time has an effect on certain materials. And people have said with Joseph Beuys, well, if he's interested in Auschwitz, he was a German pilot, if he's actually dealing with this, then why doesn't he label it that way in his class? In his work. And I had a student who did a very interesting study, that's the reason I was jumping to class, who was a sculpture student, and she said he's really involved in a kind of aesthetic that fits in with a concentration camp look. And she showed Joseph Beuys, and she showed images of concentration camps. And it was really quite intriguing, and I was working on one of Beuys's students. And so she gave me the most marvelous gift I think any student has ever given me. She went through all of her favorite books that were giving pictures of this and bought them all on eBay and, presented me with a stack of books. It was really quite incredible. The thing about the Sublime is it's got to hit you hard. And if you are forewarned about a certain topic like Auschwitz, then you get prepared for it and one can put up a certain barrier. But if you don't have that warning, a work like Beuys's can become much tougher, much more hard-hitting, and much more effective. But like any kind of trauma, what happens is one goes back and tries to replay. I say, he with the Holocaust, trying to figure some way of dealing with it artistically. And so there gets to be a little bit of rush, like, oh, this time I've got it. And then one realizes no, and then goes back and tries to figure it out. The traumatic sublime, it seems to me, is very important for someone like Sterling Ruby. Sterling Ruby is an artist who's been discussed a great deal in the last 4 or 5 years, and he's someone of great importance to me. I did a long study, and if you want to read it, you don't have to buy the catalog. You can go on my website, and it's all there, and you download it. And he was trained by Mike Kelley, who was interested in psychology, and he was trained in California at Art Center in Pasadena. And his mother had died the year before he made this piece, The Killing of the Recondite. And the recondite for him was something that was so recherché, so little known. He wanted to sort of kill that off and get to something much more fundamental. And at Art Center Pasadena, basically the teaching was they wanted the students all to theorize and figure out what a work of art was before they made it. And Sterling Ruby said, no, I don't want to do that. And so he made work in rebellion against this, working with urethane, which would set up in 5 or 10 minutes. So he would make something like this, which is playing on those sort of really corny, really, pieces that are called ghost catchers. You can buy them in tourist shops. And his mother had given him a little fountain, which reminded him of Albert Speer's, some of his architecture, say at Nuremberg marching grounds. And so he made this quite large, larger than life-size piece with urethane and plywood that he had painted black as if it was charred and burned. And it's a very powerful piece, sort of going back to this lack of effect, trying to figure it out, fitting in with the Kantian sublime of the imagination shutting off. And if I said to him he was working with the traumatic sublime or the Kantian sublime, he'd look at me and he'd be very curious and he'd say, well, tell me more. Because sometimes artists do these things very intuitively, and then it's my job to sort of figure out how do some of these things fit in with the broad cycles of human thought. His teacher, Mike Kelley, you see here, was very much involved not with the traumatic sublime, but with something that's called the abject or the uncanny. The abject is an idea of some French philosophers, Julia Kristeva. But in 1993, Mike Kelley did a show which he called The Uncanny. And he reads psychology. He loves reading the psychologists of the early 20th century, people like Freud. He reads it almost like fiction, like he's picking up a short story and reading it. So Freud's essay on the uncanny is very important for Mike Kelley. And when he did this show on the uncanny, he said, well, I don't want to put in any miniatures. I want to put in large pieces that are human, and I want to put in pieces that make me very uncomfortable, because the uncanny is about a kind of fear. Early definitions said that it was a fear caused by uncertainty, and this idea of doubt and uncertainty is very important. But Freud said the uncanny is not about something that is unfamiliar, that the uncanny is about the familiar. It's about something from childhood, something we've forgotten, but something that is so eerie when we come across it, it has that uncanny quality of recognizing it. It's a kind of like a fetish. And a fetish is a nice term for that, is something that almost has the force of being living. The uncanny has been described as saying something that looks alive can actually be dead, and something that can be dead can look alive. So mummies, mannequins, dolls, various sort of things like that can be seen as very uncanny. And they have a certain, physical sensation. We get like chill bumps or spine tingling with seeing it. Certainly Blade Runner, the film, to me seemed very much involved in the uncanny. The uncanny fits in with a kind of delight of Edmund Burke, the danger at a distance, the sense of the sort of tremor, what he referred to as a kind of frisson, but the kind of goosebumps of looking at it and saying, that looks really kind of creepy. And the uncanny can fit in with science fiction, and certainly a whole group of films. Now, these are two pieces by Mike Kelley. The one on the right, those are actually two pieces. More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid happens to be a piece that's in the Whitney's collection, so it's been shown a great deal. And what he did is he went around to junk stores and Salvation Army shops and other places, and he collected these toys, stuffed animals, primarily that were handmade stuffed animals. And these are transitional objects. Transitional objects don't represent the mother for a child, but they have this uncanny quality of familiarity. We all know that if these transitional objects get washed, my nephew had one, carried a little blanket around, and heaven forbid, if we washed it, it was no longer had this sort of incredible quality, this kind of transitional object of moving away from the mother into the world. And so what Mike Kelley did is he stitched all these together, making this huge piece of transitional objects playing on the concept of the uncanny. And certainly with this arena number 7 bears with the bears, again, all sort of transitional objects belonging to infants and toddlers, that he found. He put them around a soiled blanket, which was another kind of transitional object. So again, this is a type of Burkean sublime. The work here on the right by Charles Ray, The Male Mannequin, many people have referred to, and Mike Kelley did also, to as The Uncanny. The piece that's in the Rubel collection of Charlie, 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 which I'm sure all of you've seen, fits in very much with this idea of the sublime, this uncanny quality of the sublime, and certainly having a mannequin with genitals that look very lifelike gives this quality. The Posthuman was a catalog that was done by Jeffrey Deitch, and you may have heard of Jeffrey Deitch. He's been a great deal in the news in the last year because he's a gallerist who is now making the transition to being a museum director in LA. And I've told him repeatedly that I'm so jealous that I didn't do the Posthuman catalog. It really is wonderful. And it sort of shows what's happened with, ways of changing the human body through plastic surgery, through weightlifting, through extreme dieting, various ways of changing. And here is this is just on the back cover of it, so let me read this briefly. This book explores the implications of genetic engineering, plastic surgery, mind expansion, and other forms of body alteration to ask whether our society is developing a new model of the human being. It possesses the question of whether our society is creating a new kind of post-human person. Again, the uncanny, even though he doesn't use that term. Post-human person that replaces previous constructions of the self. Images from the new technologies in consumer culture and the new conceptually oriented figurative art, and he has 36 Americans, including people like Charlie Ray and Jeff Koons, who were in the exhibition. I did a show a number of years ago on Duane Hanson when I lived here in Florida, and I would say definitely his works have the quality of the uncanny. I was in Philadelphia before preparing for this show, and I got permission to go into the galleries and to work on and was doing notes on certain Duane Hansons, and so I was seated there in the chair. And when I would sort of stop for a few minutes to think about something, I didn't realize I was stopping. And then people would come around and they'd look at me like, are you a Duane Hanson or not? So it had that quality. And I remember when the show of his work was done at the Whitney, that kids got the idea and they would sort of lean up against a wall and they played the game of the uncanny. And what I'm saying tonight, and my idea is this is a fresh idea for looking at him and a number of these artists, which haven't been looked at in terms of the sublime, is to say, it's the Burkean sublime. It's also Freud's uncanny that is at work here. And certainly, Mike Kelley refers to people like Laurie Simmons as fitting in with the uncanny, and I'm connecting it also with the Burkean sublime, as I think is very evident with these two images. And I think we can actually look at Cindy Sherman in a new way. And years ago, when she first started making her work, people said, well, you've got to see several so you can figure out who is the real Cindy Sherman. She's not dealing with that issue of who is the real Cindy Sherman at all. It's dealing with other issues of stereotypical views of females and, taking on certain ideas that some of the feminists have been involved with. And yet, when you look at several of them, there is this uncanny quality of, are they real? Are they mannequins? What's going on here? This sort of sense of doubt, this eerie sense. I wouldn't say any of them create goosebumps unless she takes the medical models that she worked with and made some really horrific, very powerful works in the 90s dealing with some of these medical models. Now, I talked about the ecological sublime earlier. And I see it as redefining the Kantian sublime. The idea of if there is a force of nature that is such that causes the imagination to shut off, and then the second stage is when reason enters in, what about looking at nature in a different way and saying, nature isn't so dumb. Nature has its own sense of reason, and that if we can only understand it. And this is an artist who made a piece that was shown in not in Miami Basel, but one of the shows that was attendant to Miami Basel a number of years ago, and he harvested a block of ice in Alaska, and he had it sent via FedEx and had a group of MIT scientists help him to construct this refrigerator for this block of ice. And he took it first to the Bahamas, and I went down for the opening of the Bahamas, and the opening was in the elementary school where he went. Very modest, and you're seeing it here at night at the elementary school. And it's called The Distance Between What We Have and What We Want. And he worked with school children, and he was very interested in the idea that a person from the Bahamas, Matthew, God, I can't think of his last name, was with Perry in discovering the North Pole, but never got credit for it. He was a man of color, and he tried to get some of his descendants to come. But he talked to the children about ice, and the children wrote stories about it. They fantasized about what ice would be like, and then they saw the piece. What is really amazing about this is he used game theory as a way of rethinking certain of nature's laws. So he set up a structure whereby the sun's energy was used to keep the block of ice cold. The piece was shown this last year in New York, and it's still extant, now 6 years. So it's quite an amazing and really wonderful piece. And I would say this is an example of the ecological sublime, because it's attributing reason, not just to human beings, but to nature, if we can only understand and figure out how nature can work in sync. The Hegelian sublime is another sublime that is sometimes very difficult for people, but actually I think it can be simplified a great deal. If we think of the Longinian sublime as about speaking, rhetoric, giving talks, moving people profoundly. We think of the Burkean as lodged in nature. We think of the Kantian as involved with the self. Then with the Hegelian sublime, it's about the work of art. And it's a very special way of looking at limitations of the work of art. And he deals with what he calls the symbolic. And he looks at Old Testament poetry, for example, that is trying to describe this abstract Godhead within the limitations of a psalm. Or of certain works of art that are trying to express universal ideas within the limitations of a particular medium. If you've heard the idea of form and content, it's Hegelian. Hegel came up with the idea. And it seemed to me, I'm showing you a street sign there that is Hegel. It's just something I found on the internet that I thought was kind of funny, because it is like Hegel's sublime. It's a sign that is inadequate for locating you in a specific place. So you wouldn't know this is a place in Poland unless I told you. And we can rethink, I believe, a number of works by Magritte as Hegelian sublime, because when he says, this is not a pipe, it has to do with what there are two kinds of signs, a representational sign and also a sentence, and both of them are totally inadequate. And that inadequacy creates a disconnect, and that disconnect of trying to imagine something beyond the limitations of a work of art or a piece of poetry is a sublime situation. It's very similar to Kant's the imagination shutting off, but the difference here is it's a work of art that can never deal with those transcendent ideas that are supposedly involved with the sublime. And certainly an example of the Hegelian sublime would be this work of Frank Stella, which I'm showing you. It's titled Arbeit Frei, which is a sign over Auschwitz. And I wrote on Frank Stella a few years ago, and I realized at the time that he was playing this incredible game with some of his friends in the 1950s, because they would look at what certain critics had written about works of art. So one of his friends would read him this description, wouldn't tell him what the work of art was, nor the critic, and he would try to imagine what the work of art was. And it seems to me that with things like, and I've written about this, the Arbeit Arbeit macht frei, that he's basically reimagining Barnett Newman's Sublime pieces. His deductive structure, which is a term that was used by Clement Greenberg, whereby the zip, the vertical form, is deduced from the parameters, from the governing edge, according to Greenberg. And so Frank Stella deals with it as a kind of inadequacy of the work of art to symbolize or represent anything but itself. He's been heavily criticized for doing a black, I'm showing you the print, but he did, this print comes from a black painting. I wanted to make it as legible as possible, so I chose this image. He's been criticized for doing this because people say he's making light of something that is incredibly profound. And basically, I think he's dealing with the Hegelian sublime and the inadequacy of dealing with certain ideas. So we realize the work of art may try to do something else than what it really can do. And so I'm just showing you here that there are several different thinkers, Hegel. This idea of inadequacy is certainly important for Adorno, who had the idea of non-identity, and he said any society is able to deal with certain ideas and certain concepts, but there's certain concepts that go beyond its ideology. You know, how it turns things that are artificial and makes them seem natural. For example, you know, we have terms for extrovert and introvert. Very few people with the Terminator film in the future. With Damien Hirst, it was the impossibility of even coming to terms with the idea of death, which itself is very much a sublime concept. Now let me go back to this. Everyone knows the shark. It's been on view for the last couple of years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was actually ordered over the telephone, cut up into various parts, and you see that there are 3 parts here in the piece that you see here. And for the Brits, it fits in very nicely with the John Singleton Copley painting of Watson, who became the mayor of London, who lost a leg to a shark and commissioned the painting to be done. He lost it in the port of Havana and later became a baronet. But the important thing here is the sublime becomes this impossibility, the physical impossibility that you see in the title here by Damien Hirst. Now, I want to go on to the last part of the lecture to talk about 3 artists. 2 are represented in this room, so if you look over here, you see Wade Guyton, and I'm showing you a picture of Kelley Walker and Wade Guyton, and they're artists who work together, but also Kelley Walker makes his own work and Wade Guyton makes his own work. So their art is actually represented in New York by 3 distinctly different dealers: Guyton, Walker, and Guyton Walker. And I'm suggesting that they're involved with the Lyotardian sublime. Lyotard is a philosopher who has written quite a bit. He's a French philosopher in the last 30 years, actually. And he was very important for writing a short book on the postmodern condition. And he defined postmodern in a way that gets repeated a great deal. And he said postmodern is incredulity toward the meta-narrative. And you might say, what the hell does that mean? Incredulity to the meta-narrative. What he's referring to is he's saying, since the 18th century, we've had these great sweeping, big, he calls them meta-narrative. We can say big sweeping, overarching umbrella ideas. The Romanticism, Freudian psychology, Marxist philosophy, the Enlightenment. And these huge ideas have been so important and so many things have been subsumed under them. And basically what Lyotard did is he said the whole sense of knowledge has changed, and it's changed profoundly. And I think we're only beginning to deal with this kind of change in the postmodern condition, because he says instead of these huge meta-narratives, the macrosphere, we need to move to the microsphere of small differences and micrologies which deal with the logic in very small ways. It's very interesting that when I did research on these 2 artists, and I've interviewed them, and I found out that Wade Guyton had worked, and Meredyth Sparks is the other artist whom I will introduce. They worked with, they were all at the University of Tennessee together, and they worked with one teacher who was very involved in Lyotard's ideas. And then Meredyth Sparks gave me a book. She said, this is the ICA in London. It was very important on postmodernism. It's all about Lyotard. So I started thinking about the Leotardian Sublime and thought about it in relationship to their work. And the Leotardian Sublime is very interesting because it picks up from the postmodern condition, and it says, basically, there are things that never connect. Never connect. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean. First of all, this is the installation we see here in this room, and my compliments to the De La Cruz collection for acquiring this piece. I think it's really an amazing piece. Among other things, Guyton Walker is deconstructing painting. So if you ask, what is the question? What is painting? They're basically saying, well, painting is not just a picture on a wall, it's the crates, it's the wall itself. So they take sheetrock and work with it. And then they become very interested in a whole series of technological innovations in their work. And if we think back, well, the internet did start in 1969 when there was the attempt to sort of figure out ways to connect various planes in case of a nuclear attack. The World Wide Web started in 1989. Photoshop started in 1990, so it's only 20 years away, and they're using Photoshop. The first color printers were only in 1996, which is 14 years ago. And the first piece of equipment that joined together a digital cameras came earlier, but joined digital cameras, printers, and film scanners came in 1997. And Kelley Walker started making works using these plus collage and silkscreen. He was a printmaking major. Only a few years later, after the year 2000. And the works that you see in this room are involved using scanners. And what Kelley Walker would do is sometimes use toothpaste or chocolate or other things on a scanner. And so it became like another painting surface. They moved from analog to digital technology. And there's a mixture of silkscreen and other things. And if you look at the checks that all of you can see right here, and you say, well, where do they come from? Well, just look at an iPhone. And you can see occasionally when it's sort of getting in register that all those little checks come up. So they're playing very much on new technologies, but my theory is, and they kind of like the idea, they're buying into it, is that it fits in with Lyotard's Sublime, which he calls this unpronounceable word, which I have learned to pronounce, differentialist or differend. And so I came up first with the idea, well, they're differentialist artist. And my wife looked at me and said, nobody's going to ever be able to pronounce that. So I've tried the idea diffism, and I'm not going to ask you to go out and use diffism 3 times in a conversation in the next week so we can spread the gospel. But I think the idea itself is very important and a very exciting one. Where did that? Okay, this is Meredyth Sparks, just to introduce Meredyth Sparks, who is part of the group. They all started at the University of Tennessee in the 1990s. Now let me talk just about them individually. They worked with this artist who was a terribly nice guy, I don't think a most brilliant artist. He came up with the idea of the hoax archives, of taking things that could not possibly be connected and connecting them, such as the bull you see with the raccoon, or the fish with the lemur, or whatever that you see. And they also worked with this professor who wrote on Leotardian Sublime, and this is the book from the ICA that has Lyotard sort of every other page plastered over it and dealing with Lyotard's differend, an idea of the Sublime. And here is a book he also actually did on the Sublime, The Analytic of the Sublime and Lyotard. And this is the book on the differend, so if you want to see how it's spelled here. And basically what he's saying here, I will tell you, you can read through it, but the differend he cites in litigation, he says, if there are 2 parties, and one of the examples that's really kind of great is he says, if there's an Aborigine in Australia who's fighting for land rights under Aboriginal law, And he goes to a court in Australia. The court in Australia does not recognize Aboriginal law. So this person is disenfranchised. He or she has no voice. And this lack of connection, this lack of voice, is the differend. It's a difference that isn't always recognized, but is very important. And what I'm suggesting is the differend is very important because we're used to thinking of works as connecting. This is a film that was made by Costa Grava, a really wonderful film. And it's called Amen. And it's about this German SS officer who was aware of the final solution. And he went to the Pope in Italy to tell him about it. And since he was an SS officer, it's an occasion of the differend because he was disenfranchised because they said, look, the German National Socialist officers would never reveal anything like this. It has to be a kind of hoax. So he lost his voice. There was a lack of connection there. One of the telling examples by Kelley Walker is where he worked with an advertising campaign by George Loos. There's George Loos on the lower left. He was working with Braniff Airlines, and Braniff Airlines was the airlines in the 1960s. They're no longer extant. They had Calder designing planes. They had Emilio Pucci and Halston doing the outfits for the stewardesses. And there was a great campaign that was done by George Loos, which became a slogan in the 60s, and most of you are too young to remember this, but we kept saying it to each other, when you got it, flaunt it. And what he did in the ad is he had various people who would never meet each other in everyday life, such as Warhol and Sonny Liston, George Raft and Hermione Gingold, Mickey Spillane and the poet Marion Moore. And he showed them sitting together and having a conversation. This became an occasion, or could be considered an occasion, of the differend, the lack of connection. And I can't stress too important that the Sublime becomes smaller. It's reduced in size by Guyton, Walker, and Sparks. It's little tiny differences in communication, which become enormously important when you think about all the media that are involved in communication. And here is I could only get this example of a poster. I'm sorry, I should have checked with the gallery. He made a poster of this where he took a Lindt chocolate star and sort of silk screened it. And he also did silk screens from this ad where he sort of had everything off register, and he did it in CMYK, the colors. He also was very interested in this symbol of recycling, and the recycling symbol in gold leaf on the bottom is part of the De La Cruz collection. And the one above is, he's taken this and he said, basically, if you look at this, he saw it on his cereal box, it's not just about reclamation or recycling, but it's about consumption. And so the differend has this small difference, but important and significant qualifying difference that, if recycling is about consumption and consumption gets involved in recycling, you have a kind of vicious cycle that is going on. And his circle here shows go leafing. It's highly ironic, changing the voice of the reclamation piece. And what he did is he worked, certainly making a series of posters, as you see here with the Maui poster that comes from a Benetton ad. And Benetton ads were predicated on the differend. What in the world do Benetton's United Colors have to do with guys in handcuffs, with these different hearts that are all the same, with HIV, or with the Maui disaster that occurred in Hawaii? And so Kelley Walker picks up on this, and then he does another sort of layered differend. He appropriates it, like the Pictures Group, Cindy Sherman and Richard Prince and those people, and then he adds another layer. And what's interesting is with some of these people, the pieces like this that are done on CD-ROM, the people who collect them can then add another layer themselves if they wish. So again, we're used to works of art coming together, forming connections, and we're seeing an enlightened view. What these works of art are about is a lack of connection, a lack of sync. Certain ongoing disparities are very important. And I just wanted to show you some of the new painting tools that are used by Kelley Walker here. And CMYK being very important, and he realized certain toothpaste used the colors of cyan and magenta because they realized they would be reproduced beautifully, because those are the colors that are used for four-color printing process. And then he put them on a scanning plate and then connected that with a cover of King magazine. And he realized with appropriation that King magazine was picking up these sort of rear shots, just like a penthouse. If you haven't read King, when I started this, I never had looked at it, innocent that I am. And he said that it was very interesting because it looked very much like the Betty Grable pinup. And he had also seen at Paula Cooper Gallery a pinup of, or not a pinup, but this image of Linda Binglas, which was intended to be reproduced in Art Forum, and at the same time or the same season that Robert Morris presented himself as an SS stormtrooper in Art Forum. Robert Morris, the artist, minimalist artist. And this was done in the 70s. He's also dealt with the idea of the differend in terms of his Black Star series. And what he did here, I'm showing you on the image that he took, the Black Star photograph of Birmingham Race Riot, which was reproduced on the New York Times. And I'm showing you also the Kelley Walker 2 that he's taken from it and compared it to the Warhol. Warhol used a different race riot scene and a different photographer from Kelley Walker. Kelley Walker was very interested in the idea that the race riots in Birmingham were structured as a spectacle, that the person who trained the dogs, who was African American, actually trained the protesters. So if they would hold their stomach in very tightly and they were attacked by a dog, it could do less damage. And then the whole sort of group around Martin Luther King called the press and told them that there was going to be a demonstration and the police would be there with dogs. So it became a kind of spectacle. In other words, it became a commodity. And one of the things that's important for Kelley Walker is the commodification of so many different things. And so what he's done is he's superimposed chocolate, milk, white chocolate, and dark chocolate, which has nothing to do with the race riot. It fits in much more with the works by the German Dieter Roth, the American Janina Antoni, or the artist, can't think of his name, Miller, know him so well. John Miller, thank you, who uses chocolate as an almost abject substance. And so this commodification goes back to the 1980s. I'm going to move quickly because I know my time is up. And I just wanted to show what Wade Guyton does. Wade Guyton actually started with the stripes. They didn't just come from Braniff, and the stripes had to do with what I see as the differend of two different points of view. And they come from Daniel Berin, certainly. There's a printer that he uses. And I'm comparing it with, you can barely see the stripes in the George Lose ad here. And what Wade Guyton would do is he would take something from an old art history book or magazine, and he would silk screen over it. Do the things relate? Is the sum greater than the individual parts? No, it's not intended to relate. They layer, but you see the individual layers. And those spaces between them, the spaces of difference, are supposed to be very important. This was a show of Wade Guyton's that bowled me over, where he took Friedrich Petzel's gallery space and he covered the floor with plywood that he painted in this sort of very wet black enamel. And then he made with his Epson printer these fabulous works, such as the work you see here that's in the De La Cruz collection. And a lot of us tended to see them as almost like Barnett Newman's, but where Barnett Newman is dealing with a different type of sublime, a Burkean or Kantian sublime, you have a Leotardian differentialist sublime with Wade Guyton. And with someone like Meredyth Sparks, she's connecting images here of David Bowie. She's very interested in museums. I mean, musicians of the 70s, glam rock, punk, musicians because of their politics. And David Bowie was very important to her. And in the collage on the left, she's taking images of him, and then she's overlaying the images with configurations taken from Malevich. So they're appropriated from two different sources. Here you have the David Bowie, who was very important in his Ziggy Stardust album, where he was going to be the messenger who was warning the world of this grand nuclear apocalypse. And you have this very materialist sort of performer with his orange spiked hair and his great outfits, compared to Malevich, who was otherworldly. So you have immanence, transcendence, you have materialism, you have someone who is dealing with abstraction, figuration, abstraction, a lot of differences, and they're not intended to coalesce, they're not intended to come together. Here you can see the Malevich. She does the same thing with these images of Gudrun Ensslin, Gudrun Ensslin was part of the RAF, who was considered a terrorist. A marvelous series done by Gerhard Richter. She doesn't take the Richter painting, she takes the photographs that Richter marked up. So she's looking at them through the filter of Richter, and then she has the differentialist connection here with Malevich. And my last image here is a recent work by Meredyth Sparks that I'm comparing to Picasso. If you look at the word J-O-U, or the letters J-O-U, it's game, jeu, a playful thing in French. It refers also to journal, to a daily newspaper. It becomes a kind of hinge that connects these differences of this small but very important piece at the Museum of Modern Art. He's using oilcloth that looks like chair caning. He's drawing things, and you say, well, they're from disparate realities, but there is this sort of changeant, this sort of contrapuntal sort of movement back and forth, whereby there are certain hinges that connect them. Even with the Max Ernst, you find a kind of hinge where he is doing rubbings of wood with his drawing, called frottage, the drawing, the technique. But with Meredyth Sparks, there is not the interest in this. She's looking for these micrologies, the lack of connection, this space in between, the differentialist element, which is bringing the sublime down to everyday life, to an element where we can sort of see that, yes, even in art, not everything connects. So when we go surfing on the internet, we think things connect, they don't necessarily connect. It's a kind of wonderful cautionary note that is being signaled by these works of art. Thank you very much.